Welcome back to Encouraging Things. Today we're going to be making a servo skull out of things that we find at the Dollar Tree. Now we're going to start with a skull, and it does have some mold lines. Now, because I'm impatient, I only used a sharp blade to slice off the extra plastic. If you want your skull to look a little bit nicer, a little bit cleaner, you can take a sander or sandpaper and sand it down and then fill it in and make it nice and smooth. Now, most of the images I found with servo skulls are missing the mandible or their lower jaw, which makes sense as once a person has no skin, it's no longer attachable to the skull. So I took a cheap hacksaw blade and I cut mine off. If you wanted, you could leave your lower jaw on and just use that and incorporate it into your build. Or alternatively, you can cut it off and have a hinged jaw. Don't worry too much if any of your cuts are off center or you have any pieces remaining. It's always okay to have a little bit of extra that you can trim off later, which is what we're going to do in the next step. Now, to trim off the extra, I did just use a pair of plastic nippers because I found it gave me a much sharper angle of cuts than the hacksaw blade did, and it did leave a less mess to clean up with a file later. If you don't happen to have a pair of clippers, you can use anything, a saw, blade, anything that can cut soft plastic. Now that I've roughly shaped out what I want my skull to look like, it's time to get to the fun part, which is adding bits and pieces to make it look more like a servo skull. When I was first considering this build, I took a look at the packaging for the Final Faction parts, and I got a general idea of the parts and pieces that I wanted to use for the build. However, once I opened the packaging, I did have to take a closer look at some of the parts because parts of them were hidden that I couldn't see, and it gave me a better idea of what I wanted to use. Even so, it still took some time and some effort to move the pieces around and find out where they fit on the skull and whether or not I wanted to use them and if I had to trim any parts off. Once I'd found all the parts I wanted to start with, it was time to make my first cut. Now, this is my first ever real scratch build where I'll be taking a part or a piece and then cutting it and making something new with it. It did make me a little nervous only because once you make a complete cut, you really can't go back. In some circumstances, you can take the cut and glue it back together and recut if you'd like. But once you make that initial cut, you're going to have a seam or something that you have to deal with, and that's always made me nervous when it comes to scratch building. As the Final Faction parts are injection molded, they do have some seam lines. Now, you can go over each one and sand it and fill it if you want really high detailed models, but again, since I was going through this rather quickly and just for fun, I only took a sharp blade to mine and just cleaned off the edges a little bit. One of the prominent features of a servo skull is some form of arm or manipulator device that it uses in order to interact with the world, and I knew that I wanted mine to have the same thing. But since I was limiting myself to Final Faction parts or parts that I found at the Dollar Tree, I really didn't have anything that worked as an armature. However, one of the packages did come with these leg extenders, which had a couple of gears and pin systems with them. Once I was able to trim off the excess panels, it did look more like an armature than like a leg brace. So I was able to use this part as an armature. Another prominent feature of a servo skull is usually their eyes. It's a glowing red or green eye socket, or sensor system on their eye socket. So I used a drill bit to drill a hole in the eye socket of this particular skull in order to allow for light to shine through. Keeping in the spirit of the build, the glue that I've chosen are one-time use super glue from the Dollar Tree. With the first piece in place being the eye socket, it's now time to take a look at the electronics of this particular servo skull. In this case, we're going to be using a motion-activated light system from another skull that I also got at the Dollar Tree from an animated skeleton that laughs. That's enough of that. Now with this setup, once you cut the speaker off, the lights no longer blink and they just stay on while it's activated. This is great. The only downside with this build is there is no way to replace the battery. Once I trimmed all the parts down in order to fit inside the skull, I then took the skull and added in a black paint on the inside. The paint didn't cover as much as I wanted it to, so it did end up leaking some light, but this was a quick and fast, fun build, so again, I'm not super concerned. If you want your build to look a little bit better and maybe not have light leaks, I would suggest taking it and just using a light black wash and letting it swirl around inside the skull before you cut a bunch of holes in it. In order to turn everything on and off, I did want to cut a hole in the top of the skull to allow the on-off switch to punch through. This is very similar to the original skull that it came with, and so it was easy just to copy the design over and trim out a little hole. Once I confirmed everything was working properly, I just used some hot glue to secure everything in place. So here's a fun fact about me. I have never played a tabletop game. Now don't get me wrong, I've played board games when I was a kid. I played Sorry and Monopoly. I played card games, all those things. I even played Magic the Gathering a few times. But I've never played a game that required any kind of physical presence on the board. And I don't know why that is. I think it was because when I was younger, I moved around a lot, so I didn't have a close group of friends. At least not for very long. And then with those groups of friends, we really didn't have much in the way of geeks and nerds. Now you have to remember, I'm old. I'm old. This was the time before the internet. Or before the internet as we know it today. And so you couldn't get Facebook groups together. Couldn't get any groups together. Unless you lived nearby. No email. Only snail mail. It was difficult. So when I was young, it was hard to put together these types of games, even though they existed. Mostly because of separation and moving around. Then on top of that, you add the cost. Wizards of the Coast basically owned everything that was worth playing. I don't remember the first time I was introduced to Warhammer 40K. I remember playing the games. Actually, now that I think about it, that was probably it. It was probably when I was playing the games, when I was playing the original RTS Warhammer 40K. I really liked the intro cutscenes. I liked the design and the aesthetic, and even though there were orcs, and I'm not a big fan of sword and board type games or shows, even though there were orcs, there were guns. Big guns, tanks, mechanical beasties. That really drew my attention. Now, being an avid video game player rather than an avid tabletop player, I really loved waiting for the next Warhammer game. I will say that I really do enjoy Warhammer 40K Space Marine. It is a great game. Of course, the ending suggested there was going to be a sequel. I think they even announced a sequel. But I haven't seen any of it. In recent years, because the Wizards of the Coast is having trouble fighting against 3D printers, they have been selling a lot of their IPs to game makers, which means a lot of stuff is hit or miss. But I will say that if nothing else, they at least stick to the aesthetic. I think there's something psychologically interesting about a race of people who worship technology, where you have the fear of God placed into people where God is a machine. At least that's what I take from it. I'm not really big on the lore. I'm mostly a visual player. I like the way it looks. Come to think of it, I've never even read a Warhammer book. I've wanted to, I've thought about it. Well, like a lot of series, such as MechWarrior, Warhammer, even Star Wars, there are so many different authors and so many different storylines. Where do you start? Where's the beginning? Is there a beginning? If there's not, I'd love for you guys to recommend me some titles. I've read snippets of some of the stuff that comes out of those books, and I think they're really well written. Not by any particular author, just well written. Something worthy to read. One of the things I had considered during this build is the base that the skull would sit on in order to look like it was floating. Luckily, I found these small spiders at the Dollar Tree, and the spring is easily removed. However, the armature that I placed on the skull created a situation where the base of the spring wasn't able to reach the ground. So I had to come up with a different solution. I added the barrel-looking thing to the bottom of the skull to cover up the electronics and give additional depth to the skull in order for the base to work. However, even with that addition, the armature hung way too low, so I still wasn't able to use the base. Now you can't have a servo skull without hanging or loose wires. To simulate this, I am using gardening wire that I found at the Dollar Tree. It's cheap and it's flimsy, however if you twine it right, or hang it right, it looks exactly like wire at this scale. Let's talk about scratch building for a minute. I have never scratch built anything before. Now for those of you who watch makers, especially scratch builders, model makers, diorama crafters, whatever you want to call them, a common statement that they make is, when I was a kid, I used cardboard. Even Adam Savage, one of the greatest makers of our time, I think we would all agree, he tells us he'd make everything out of cardboard. I won't say I never had an abundance of cardboard, mostly because I moved a lot as a kid. So at least for a short period of time after each moved, I would have a ton of cardboard. But it just never occurred to me to take two pieces of it and glue them together. And I think it's because scratch building is something that you learn, or can learn. Let me put it that way. Because I know there are people out there who will see two things that have nothing to do with each other and figure out a way to slice them up, put them together, and make them look twice as awesome as they did sitting side by side. I can't do that. Or at least it is not a natural talent that I have. But I am able to learn. And by watching crafters and YouTube videos, seeing skills and techniques used by other people, and understanding how to recognize certain shapes, parts of a shape, not taking the whole. Because I am very much a whole is the sum of its parts kind of person. I think to be a scratch builder, you have to be the parts are the sum of the whole kind of person. Where taking a large chunk of something and then slicing it up in your mind is very easy. You literally explode the diagram in your head and see all the parts and pieces and where you can put them. And even with the best scratch builders, it does take some interaction. You do have to rub two things together to see if they'll fit, and then at that point make adjustments. But I never for once thought that I could be that guy. That I could do scratch building. I was in awe of the people who could take these things and squish them together. And then when they were done and they painted it, that's when I'd see it. Because that's when it would become whole again. And that's the part I had to learn. To see the whole when it wasn't unified. A pink part here, a blue part there, a white part there, all glued together. And you look at them and you have to see it as a whole, even though you know it's not one piece. I think I'm starting to get it now. At least I hope I am. I'd like to say thank you to everybody who supports the channel. And that includes everybody who clicks on the thumbnails, watches the video, leaves a like, a comment, subscribes, and hits the bell. And of course, I'd like to give a big shout out to my patrons, those people who have gone the extra step to help support the channel monetarily. By this time, I figure that most of us know what Patreon is. But for the few of you who may not, Patreon is a way to directly support art and artists. And for as little as $1 a month, you can help support channels that you enjoy, whether it's this channel or any other channel. And you may not believe that $1 a month can make a difference, but believe me, it can. So thank you, patrons, and viewers, likers, subscribers, and bell ringers. I appreciate every one of you. I hate making mistakes. That's why I don't really like painting. I'm absolutely afraid of making a massive mistake where I put paint in the wrong place and then I can't recover, and now I have this blotch. And it gets worse as you go on. The further you get into a build, the more you think, oh, what if I mess up here? What if I mess up here? The hour is gone. It turns out it's not as bad as you think. As you've seen in this build, there are a couple of places where I got paint where it shouldn't have been. And for the first time ever, I actually swallowed that urge to just stop. And it was there too. It was strong. I had that urge. I saw paint hit a spot it wasn't supposed to, and I went, oh, I should just stop. I'm done. This is terrible. But I didn't. I just kept going, and I said, I'll fix it later. I will fix it later. I'm actually really proud of myself for that. For moving past that moment, because in the past, that would have been where it ended. I wouldn't have pushed forward. I wouldn't have tried to keep going. I would have just said, ugh, no more. I may have come back to it later, but probably not. It would have sat until it got thrown in a box or thrown away. So if you're ever afraid that you're going to make a mistake, you are. And that's okay. Push past it. Fix it later. That's how you finish a project. Well, as it turns out, I had a little bit of super glue left over and I didn't want it to go to waste. So I made a second one. For the first two scratch builds I've ever done, I think these turned out excellent. I really like the paint job. It looks dingy and dark and world appropriate, at least in person. I really enjoy the fact that they're both interactive in different ways. One is a motion sensor, and the other one's a bobblehead. And as with everything in this build, you can find all the pieces and parts for this, at least seasonally, around Halloween at the Dollar Tree or your local dollar store. And I encourage each and every one of you to build your own Servo skull, to come up with your own designs and to see what you can do with the parts and pieces that I've displayed here, or whatever parts and pieces you can find at your own dollar store. And as always, I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. Thank you for watching.